Okay, so we're in Tractate Menachot. This is Daf 8. So at the end of 7 it says, the Gemara returns to the issue of the sanctification of blood collected in two vessels. And did Rabbi Elazar really say this, that blood is sanctified only when a full measure is initially collected in a single vessel? But it was stated with regard to the high priest girdle cake offering. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is not sanctified in halves. That is, if half of a tenth of an ephah was placed on one vessel and a second half in another vessel, neither is sanctified. So Rabbi Elazar says, since it is sacrificed in halves, as half of the meal offering is sacrificed in the morning and half in the afternoon, it may be sanctified in halves. So, and if it is so, that Rabbi Elazar holds that blood may not be sanctified in halves, let him derive the halach of the high priest girdle cake offering from that of blood. And if you would say that in this case Rabbi Elazar does not derive the halach of the matter of a meal offering from that of another matter, that is difficult. But doesn't Rabbi Elazar say a meal offering from which the priest removed a handful while inside the sanctuary is valid, despite the fact that the handful should be removed in the temple courtyard? The reason is that we find a similar case in the sanctuary with regard to the removal of the bowls of frankincense from the table of the showbread. Just as the bowls permit the showbread for consumption when removed in the sanctuary, so too the handful permits the remainder of the meal offering for consumption. So this indicates that Rabbi Elazar does derive the halacha of a meal offering from that of another matter. So the Gemara responds, Rabbi Elazar does derive the halacha with regard to a meal offering from that of another meal offering. The showbread is considered a meal offering, but does he not derive the halacha with regard to a meal offering from that of blood? The Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Elazar derive the halach of one meal offering from that of another meal offering? But isn't it taught in a Braita, if before the priest detached the arrangement of showbread and the bowls of frankincense from upon the table, the bread broke into pieces, the bread is unfit for consumption, and the priest does not burn the frankincense contained in the bowls on account of it. And if the bread broke after the priest detached it, the bread is unfit, but the priest burns the frankincense contained in the bowls on account of it. So the Gemara continues, and Rabbi Elazar says, when the Baraita refers to the detachment of the showbread, it does not mean that the priest actually detached it. Rather, it means that once the time to detach it has arrived, even though he has not yet detached it and has not removed the bowls, it is considered as though he has detached it. Accordingly, if the showbread broke after that time, the frankincense is burned. The Gemara explains its question. And if Rabbi Elazar derives the halach of one meal offering from another, why does he say that frankincense contained in the bowls are burned in a case where the showbread broke when the time to detach the bread had arrived? It should be like the case of a meal offering that became lacking in its measure before the removal of the handful. Such a handful is not removed and is not sacrificed upon the altar. Likewise, the frankincense was still on the table when the showbread broke and should therefore be disqualified. So the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, as there is a difference between these meal offerings in the case of the meal offering that became lacking before the removal of a handful. Its handful was not clearly designated. Consequently, if the meal offering became lacking before a handful was removed, one may no longer remove a handful from it. But in the case of the showbread and the bowls of frankincense, its handful, the frankincense, was clearly designated at the time when the frankincense was placed in the bowls, since the frankincense is in a separate container from the bread, and therefore once the time to detach the bread has arrived, it is considered as though he has detached it. So the Gemara asks, and if that is so, then even if the time to detach the showbread arrived, why is the frankincense burned? It should be like a case where the remainder of a meal offering became lacking between the removal of the handful and the burning upon the altar. The halacha in this case is that one does not burn the handful on account of such a meal offering. The Gemara responds, isn't it a dispute among the Amoraim whether or not the handful is burned in such a case? One can say that Rabbi Elazar holds in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that if the remainder of a meal offering became lacking between the removal of the handful and the burning, the priest burns the handful on account of such a meal offering. The Gemara discusses the matter itself. With regard to the girdle cake offering of the high priest, Rabbi Yochanan says that it is not sanctified in halves, and Rabbi Elazar says, since it is sacrificed in halves, as half of the meal offering is sacrificed in the morning and half in the afternoon, it may likewise be sanctified in halves. So Rabbi Acha said, what is the reason of Rabbi Yochanan? The verse states, a meal offering perpetually, half of it in the morning, half of it in the evening, Leviticus 6:13. This means first bring a whole meal offering and only afterward divide it into halves. So the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. The Mishnah teaches the girdle cake offering of the high priest did not come in halves. Rather, the high priest brings a full tenth of an ephah and then divides it into two. And it is taught in a Baraita with regard to this Mishnah, if it were stated a meal offering, half in the morning, half in the evening, I would say he brings half of a tenth from his house in the morning and sacrifices it, and another half of a tenth from his home in the evening and sacrifices it. Therefore, the verse states half of it in the morning, indicating that he brings a half from a whole, and he does not bring a half by itself. The Gemara responds, Rabbi Elazar maintains that the verse requires that a whole meal offering to be brought in the morning only for a mitzvah. So nevertheless, if half of a tenth was brought in the morning, it is valid after the fact. So Rav Gviha from Be Katil said to Rav Ashi, but the term statute is written with regard to the girdle cake offering, as the verse states, a statute forever, Leviticus 6:15. And there is a principle that whenever the Torah calls a mitzvah a statute, the details of its performance are indispensable. So Rav Ashi said to him, it was necessary for the Torah to define this mitzvah as a statute only with regard to the requirement that the high priest bring a full tenth from his home. With regard to its sanctification, any service vessel can be sanctified in halves. The Gemara asked, and did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? But it was stated, if one set aside half a tenth of an ephah for a meal offering, and his intention was to add to the half in order to reach a full tenth, Rav says that it is not sanctified, and he did not bring a full tenth, and Rabbi Yochanan says that it is sanctified. And if it is so that Rabbi Yochanan holds that the girdle cake offering cannot be sanctified in the halves, let him derive from the girdle cake offering that no meal offering may be sanctified in halves. And if you would say that Rabbi Yochanan does not derive the halacha of one matter with regard to consecrated items from that of another matter, that is difficult. But doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say, peace offerings that were slaughtered in the sanctuary are valid, as it is written, and slaughtered at the entrance of the tent of meeting, Leviticus 3:2, in the courtyard. So Rabbi Yochanan explains, it is logical that the halacha with regard to the minor area, the courtyard, should not be more stringent than the halacha with regard to the major area, so the tent of meeting. So evidently, Rabbi Yochanan derives a halacha with regard to the sanctuary from the temple courtyard. The Gemara responds, Rabbi Yochanan does in fact derive the halacha of one matter from another, and therefore he learns the halacha with regard to all meal offerings from the girdle cake offering, that in theory they are not sanctified in halves. But a case where one expresses his intention to add to the half measure is different, as it is taught in the Baraita with regard to the verse, both of them full of fine flour, Numbers 7:13. Full is a reference only to full measurements, that is to say, the flour is not sanctified until there is a full tenth inside the vessel. And Rabbi Yoshi said, when is it the halacha that the flour is sanctified only in a full tenth is inside the vessel? It is at a time when his intention was not initially to add to that which he placed inside the vessel, but at a time when his intention was initially to add each initial bit of flour is sanctified by the vessel. The Gemara asks, and Rav, who holds that the standard meal offerings are not sanctified in halves, even if one's initial intention was to add to the half, with regard to a girdle cake offering, in accordance with whose opinion does he hold? If he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says that a girdle cake offering can be sanctified in halves, then let him derive from the halacha of girdle cake offerings that all meal offerings may be sanctified in halves. And if you would say that Rav does not derive the halacha of one matter from that of another matter, that is difficult. But doesn't Rav say a standard meal offering, which is brought with oil and frankincense, is sanctified by a service vessel even without its oil and without its frankincense? It is sanctified without its oil, as we find such a halacha with regard to the showbread, which is sacrificed without oil and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel. Similarly, it is sanctified even without its frankincense, as we find such a halacha with regard to the meal offering accompanying the libations of an offering, which is sacrificed without frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel. So finally, a standard meal offering is sanctified by a service vessel even without its oil and without its frankincense, as we find with regard to the meal offering of the sinner, which includes neither of these. This indicates that Rav does derive the halacha of a meal offering from other meal offerings. Rather, perforce, with regard to the girdle cake offering, Rav holds, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, that this offering is not sanctified in halves, and it is derived from there that no meal offerings are sanctified in halves. The Gemara discusses the matter itself. Rav says that a meal offering is sanctified without its oil, and its halacha is not the same as when a tenth of an ephah of flour is lacking, as we find such a halacha with regard to the showbread, which is sacrificed without oil and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel. So similarly, it is sanctified even without its frankincense, as we find such a halacha with regard to the meal offering accompanying the libations of an offering, which is sacrificed without frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified. Additionally, a meal offering is sanctified even without its oil and without its frankincense, as we find such a halacha with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, which lacks both oil and frankincense and is nevertheless sanctified by a service vessel. So Rav continues, in oil and frankincense are each sanctified by service vessels. This substance without that one, and that substance without this one. Oil is sanctified on its own, as we find such a halacha with regard to the log of oil of a leper, which is sanctified on its own. Frankincense is sanctified on its own, as we find such halacha with regard to the frankincense that comes in the bowls that are brought with the showbread. There is no oil in that case, and yet the frankincense is sanctified in the bowls. And Rabbi Hanina says, neither is this substance sanctified without that, nor is that sanctified without this. Rather, any meal offering that requires oil and frankincense is sanctified by a service vessel only when the flour, oil, and frankincense are placed in the same vessel at the same time. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, for what purpose was the vessel that measured a tenth of an ephah anointed, making it possible for it to sanctify items placed inside it? This vessel was fashioned only for measuring flour, and according to Rabbi Hanina, the flour is not sanctified without oil. What then does this vessel sanctify? So the Gemara answers, the vessel was anointed for the purpose of sanctifying the meal offering of a sinner, which contains neither oil nor frankincense. The Gemara further asks, and for what purpose was the vessel that measured one log of oil anointed? After all, according to Rabbi Hanina, oil for a meal offering cannot be sanctified by itself. The Gemara explains, it was anointed for the purpose of sanctifying the log of oil of a leper, which is not brought as part of a meal offering. This oil is sanctified without flour or frankincense. The Gemara notes, and Shmuel also holds in accordance with this statement of Rav, that a service vessel sanctifies the flour of a meal offering even without its oil. As we learned in a Mishnah, Zvachim 88a, the vessels used for liquids sanctify only the liquids, and the vessels that serve as dry measures sanctify only dry goods. But the vessels used for liquids do not sanctify the dry goods, and the vessels for dry measures do not sanctify the liquids. And Shmuel says, with regard to this Mishnah, they taught that vessels used for liquids do not sanctify dry goods only with regard to the vessels used as measures, but bowls that are used for collecting and tossing the blood of offerings sanctify the dry goods as well, as it is stated with regard to offerings of the princes brought during the inauguration of the tabernacle, both of them full of fine flour mixed with oil for a meal offering, number 713, which indicates that the bowl sanctifies meal offerings which are dry. The Gemara continues its proof. And Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, with regard to the derivation of Shmuel, but the meal offering of the verse is also considered a liquid, as it is mingled with oil. How then can one derive from it the halacha with regard to items that are entirely dry? So Ravina said to him, the verse cited by Shmuel is necessary only to teach that the dry part of a meal offering, that is, the frankincense, which invariably does not come into contact with the oil, is sanctified by the bowls as well. The Gemara concludes its proof with regard to Shmuel's opinion, and if it enters your mind that Shmuel holds that a meal offering is not sanctified by a service vessel until all of its components are together in the vessel, then how can you find a case where the dry parts of a meal offering are by themselves? Is it not correct that when meal offerings are sanctified, all of them are liquids due to the oil that is mixed with them? Rather, conclude from here that Shmuel holds that this substance may be sanctified without that one. And if you wish, say instead, in answer to Rav Acha of Difti's question, a meal offering, even when it is mixed with oil, is relative to blood, considered as a dry item. So accordingly, one may derive from the verse that the bowls sanctify dry items, and just as a bowl sanctifies a meal offering that contains oil, as it is considered dry in comparison to blood, so too it sanctifies a meal offering that is entirely dry, that contains no oil, as claimed by Rav. So the Gemara discusses the matter itself. So Rabbi Elazar says a meal offering from which the priest removed a handful while inside the sanctuary is valid, despite the fact that the handful should be removed in the temple courtyard. The reason is that we find a similar case in the sanctuary with regard to the removal of the bowls of frankincense for the table of the showbread. Just as the bowls permit the showbread for consumption, so too the handful permits the remainder of the meal offering for consumption. Rabbi Yirmiyah raised an objection to this opinion from a Braita discussing the verse. And he shall bring it to Aaron's sons the priest, and he shall remove from there his handful. Leviticus 2:2. The verse indicates that the removal of a handful from the meal offering may be performed from the place where the feet of the non-priest may stand anywhere within the temple courtyard. Basically, anywhere within the temple courtyard. So, the Braita continues, Ben Betera, who holds that a handful is not disqualified when removed with the left hand, says that the verse should be interpreted as follows. From where is it derived that if one removed a handful with his left hand, that he must return the handful to the vessel that contains the meal offering, and again remove the handful with his right hand. The verse states, and he shall remove from there. This indicates that the handful is removed from the place where he already removed it. That is, the handful is returned to the meal offering and thereupon removed from the same meal offering, this time with his right hand. It is clear from the statement of the first Tana that the handful of the meal offering may be removed only in the place where the feet of a non-priest may stand, but not in the sanctuary. Some say that Rabbi Yirmiyah raised the objection and he resolves it as well, and some say that Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, I will explain to you the resolution of this objection, he says. The verse is necessary only to permit the entire temple courtyard from removing the handful there, not to prohibit the removal of a handful inside the sanctuary. The reason is that you should not say, since a burnt offering is an offering of the most sacred order, and a meal offering is likewise an offering of the most sacred order, then just as a burnt offering requires that its slaughter be performed in the northern part of the temple courtyard, so too a meal offering requires that the removal of its handful be in the northern part. The Gemara raises a difficulty with regard to this comparison. What is notable about a burnt offering? It is notable in that it is more sacred, as it is consumed in its entirety upon the altar. The Gemara responds, the same comparison may be drawn from a sin offering, which is also an offering of the most sacred order and is not sacrificed in its entirety upon the altar, and yet it must be slaughtered in the northern part of the temple courtyard. So the Gemara raises a difficulty with regard to this comparison as well. What is notable about a sin offering? It is notable in that the halachot of a sin offering are more stringent, as its sacrifice atones for those sins whose transgression causes one to be liable to receive karet. The Gemara responds, the comparison may be drawn from a guilt offering, as it too is an offering of the most sacred order. It is not sacrificed in its entirety upon the altar. It does not atone for such sins, and yet it must be slaughtered in the northern part of the temple courtyard. The Gemara raises this suggestion as well. What is notable about a guilt offering? It is notable in that a guilt offering has a lower status as it is one of the types of offerings whose atonement is achieved through their blood. So it is an animal offering. So the Gemara adds, once this claim has been accepted from all of them as well, from a burnt offering and sin offering, one cannot draw a comparison to a meal offering either, as they are all of the types of offerings whose atonement is achieved through their blood. Rather, the verse was necessary in order to permit the removal of a handful anywhere in the temple courtyard, because it might enter your mind to say that since it is written, and it shall be presented to the priest, and he shall bring it to the altar, Leviticus 2:8, and it states, and he shall remove from there his handful, Leviticus 2:2, one could claim, just as the bringing of the meal offering is in the southwestern corner of the altar, so too the removal of the handful must also be performed in the southwestern corner. Therefore, the verse teaches us that the removal of the handful may be performed anywhere in the courtyard, but this does not serve to exclude the sanctuary. So the Gemara discusses the matter itself. So Rabbi Yochanan says, peace offerings that were slaughtered in the sanctuary are valid, as it is stated, and slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, Leviticus 3:2, in the courtyard, essentially. And it is logical that the halakha with regard to the minor area, the courtyard, should not be more stringent than the halakha with regard to the major one, so the tent of meeting in the sanctuary. The Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan from Braita. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, from where is it derived that if Gentiles surrounded the temple courtyard and were firing projectiles inside to the point that it became impossible to remain in the courtyard on account of the threat, that the priest enter the sanctuary and partake of the offerings of the most sacred order and the remainders of the meal offerings while inside the sanctuary? And the verse states, and that is the end of Daf 8, but I'll read it. Every meal offering of theirs and every sin offering of theirs and every guilt offering of theirs which they may render unto me shall be most holy for you and for your sons. In the sanctuary shall you eat them. Numbers 18, 9 through 10. Okay, thanks for watching.